Some wars are fought over land, others over power. Mine began with the strangest of battlefields, my own driveway. It started the day I packed my boxes. Cardboard stacked high, taped neatly with the precision of a man ready to leave behind years of nonsense. The kind of nonsense that only someone who has lived under the thumb of a homeowners association can truly understand. For years, I endured their endless rules. Grass cut no longer than 2 inches. No holiday lights before December. Mailbox painted only in one shade of beige, purchased from a single approved vendor. I laughed at first, thinking the rules were silly quirks. But the laughter faded as fines arrived for imagined infractions. A $75 $5 warning for a garbage can left visible for 3 minutes. A $200 penalty for planting a flower bed they claimed was non-compliant. And presiding over all of it was one woman. Her name wasn't Karen, but she embodied the spirit so fully that the label fit like a crown she never asked for, but always wore. She patrolled the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff, clipboard in hand, snapping photos of violations as if she were documenting crimes. To her, I wasn't a neighbor. I was a case file. So when I decided I had enough and planned to move out, I thought I'd finally be free. I didn't imagine she'd try to stop me. But Karen had other ideas. She believed, somehow, that moving out of my own house, my own property, required her permission. She cornered me in the driveway, demanding forms, approvals, a review by the board. She waved bylaws in my face, quoting passages she didn't understand, but weaponized all the same. And when I laughed her off, taping shut the last of my boxes, she made a call. Not to the board, not to a lawyer, not even to a neighbor to gossip. She called the cops, and in that single absurd decision, she triggered a chain of events she could never have predicted. Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that my son was no ordinary man helping his father move. My son was an FBI agent. Moving out of that neighborhood wasn't just a decision, it was an escape. The house itself was beautiful. A 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch, tucked neatly against a small lake. It had been my dream home once, a reward for decades of work. But dreams curdle when they're policed. The HOA transformed what should have been peace into a daily grind of petty conflicts. Every morning brought a new notice, a fresh complaint. The mailbox was crooked by a centimeter. My pickup truck was unsightly if parked in the driveway. My granddaughter's bicycle, left on the lawn for an hour, was deemed hazardous. Living there meant living under constant surveillance. And Karen was the enforcer. She took her role beyond obsession. She knew everyone's schedule, everyone's routines. She timed her walks to catch violations, snapping pictures and logging them in neat folders she kept in her home office. The HOA board admired her diligence, but the rest of us called it what it was: harassment. I'd endured it longer than most because I'd invested so much in that house. But the day I received a $500 fine for unauthorized garden decorations, a row of solar lights bought at the hardware store, I snapped. I listed the house the next morning. It sold quickly, too. Families were eager for lakefront property, even if it came with the price of Karen's scrutiny. As soon as the ink dried, I started packing. That was when Karen began circling like a hawk. First came the letters slipped under my door, warning that moving required proper clearance. Then the emails, citing obscure bylaw passages that said nothing about leaving but everything about community cohesion. Finally, she appeared in person, demanding I attend an emergency HOA meeting to review the move-out process. I ignored her. My contract was signed, the buyers were ready, and legally, there was nothing she could do. At least, that's what I thought. The morning of the incident, my son arrived to help. He wore jeans and a plain t-shirt, nothing to distinguish him as anything other than a man lending a hand. To Karen, he was just another box carrier. She couldn't have guessed that behind the casual clothes was a federal badge, and years of experience dealing with people far more dangerous than her. We worked in silence, loading boxes into the truck. The sun beat down, the cicadas hummed, and I felt the first taste of freedom, until Karen marched across the lawn. She stood at the edge of the driveway, phone in hand, eyes blazing with triumph. She announced loudly enough for the whole street to hear that I was violating HOA departure protocols. She warned that I was removing property without authorization. And then she did the unthinkable. She dialed 911. I watched in stunned silence as she fabricated a story for the dispatcher, claiming I was stealing assets from the HOA. She described the moving truck as if it were a getaway vehicle. She even implied my son was an accomplice. By the time she hung up, her face glowed with smug satisfaction. She crossed her arms, certain that she had won. The law, in her mind, was on her side. What she didn't know was that the real law, the kind that transcends her petty bylaws, was standing right beside me. The first cruiser arrived in less than 10 minutes. Blue lights flashed down the quiet suburban street, painting the neatly trimmed lawns in shades of red and violet. Curtains twitched as neighbors peered out, sensing entertainment. A moving truck wasn't interesting, but a police car? That promised gossip for weeks. Karen stood taller, her arms folded like a general welcoming reinforcements. She practically beamed as the officer stepped out, adjusting his belt and scanning the scene. "This way, officer," she called, waving him toward the driveway as though she'd summoned him personally. I stood by the truck, box in hand, frozen in a moment so surreal it felt like satire. My son leaned against the tailgate, calm as ever, his expression unreadable. Karen launched into her performance. She pointed at the truck, at the boxes stacked neatly inside, and at me. Her words poured out in a flood. Unauthorized removal of property, potential theft, violation of HOA bylaws, suspicious individuals on the premises. Each accusation sounded more desperate than the last, but she delivered them with the conviction of someone convinced the world operated on her terms. The officer listened politely, nodding occasionally. Then he turned to me. "Sir, can you explain what's happening here?" I set the box down slowly, taking a steadying breath. Before I could answer, Karen cut in. "He's moving out without permission," she snapped. "The HOA hasn't approved his departure. He's taking community assets. You need to stop him before it's too late." The officer blinked, confusion flashing across his face. "Community assets?" She gestured toward my truck. "Those items belong to the association until they've been cleared. We can't allow people to just up and leave. There's a process." It was almost laughable, if not for the fact that a uniformed cop was standing there, notebook in hand, treating her claims with some level of seriousness. I could feel my pulse quicken. Absurd or not, the situation was escalating. My son finally spoke, his voice measured and calm. "Officer, everything in that truck belongs to my father. The house has been sold legally. He's moving out. There's nothing here that concerns the HOA." Karen's head snapped toward him. "And who are you? Another thief? His accomplice?" The officer held up a hand, trying to quiet the exchange. "Ma'am, let's give him a chance to explain." But Karen wouldn't be silenced. She doubled down, producing a folder from her tote bag. She flipped through pages of printed bylaws, pointing to highlighted passages that, on closer inspection, had nothing to do with moving out. Rules about landscaping, regulations about fence height, guidelines for paint colors. She spun each one into some vague justification for her crusade. The officer frowned, clearly struggling to reconcile her claims with reality. Still, he asked me for identification, then turned to my son. That was the moment everything shifted. My son handed over his driver's license, and with it, his badge. The officer's demeanor changed instantly. His spine straightened, and his tone grew sharper and more respectful. He examined the badge carefully, then met my son's eyes with a look of recognition. Karen, oblivious, continued her tirade. "You see? They're trying to intimidate you. This is what happens when you let people ignore the rules. He thinks he can just walk away from his obligations. Well, not in my neighborhood." The officer raised a hand again, but this time his patience was thinner. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down." But Karen couldn't stop. The spotlight was on her, and she reveled in it. She accused me of financial fraud, of collusion, and of damaging community morale. She even suggested the moving truck was illegally parked, as though that might justify the spectacle. Meanwhile, the flashing lights drew more attention. Another cruiser arrived, then another. Soon, 3 officers stood in my driveway, listening to Karen weave a tapestry of paranoia. Neighbors gathered at a safe distance, whispering behind cupped hands, their expressions caught between amusement and disbelief. And through it all, my son remained still, his arms crossed, his gaze steady on the officers. He didn't flaunt his authority, didn't boast, and didn't even interrupt. He simply existed in quiet contrast to Karen's hysteria, calm, rational, and immovable. The officers eventually turned back to me, asking for closing clarification. I explained again, the house was sold, the belongings were mine, and the move was legal. Karen had no claim. My son added a few key points, his tone clipped and professional, emphasizing property rights and the limits of HOA authority. The officers exchanged glances. One scribbled in his notebook. Another shook his head slightly. Karen sensed the tide turning and grew more desperate. She accused the police of corruption and suggested they were being manipulated. She warned them they'd regret ignoring the bylaws. It was almost painful to watch. By then, the rising action had stretched into spectacle. The cul-de-sac buzzed with quiet laughter and shaking heads. To them, this was the ultimate unraveling of the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. But for me, it was something else, the slow, steady build-up to a moment I'd never forget. Because while the officers were nearly convinced, it wasn't their dismissal of Karen that would end this. It was my son. He hadn't yet revealed his hand. He hadn't used his authority. He'd simply let her dig her own grave. And when the time came, when her arrogance reached its peak, he would strike with the precision of someone who understood power better than she ever could. Karen thought she was the law. She was about to find out what real law looked like. The air felt heavy, thick with the kind of tension you could almost taste. 3 cruisers, flashing lights, neighbors circling like moths to a flame. My moving boxes sat abandoned mid-load, forgotten as the absurdity of the situation overtook the day. Karen stood in the center of it all, chin raised, basking in the glow of her self-righteousness. To her, this was a triumph. She had called the cops, and they had come. She had assembled an audience. She had wielded her beloved bylaws like weapons. In her mind, the neighborhood had just witnessed proof of her dominance. She didn't see what was coming. The lead officer finally closed his notebook. His expression carried the weary patience of someone who had entertained an eccentric long enough. He turned to me and spoke plainly. "Sir, as far as I can tell, you're within your rights. You've sold the house. These belongings are yours. There's no criminal issue here." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. For anyone else, they would have been the end. But not for Karen. She erupted, her voice shrill and cracking. "No, you don't understand. The HOA hasn't authorized his departure. There's paperwork. There's a procedure. You can't just let him leave." The officer rubbed his temple, clearly done with the circus. "Ma'am, this is a civil matter. It's not something the police can enforce." Karen's face darkened, her fists clenched at her sides. She wasn't just losing the battle. She was losing control of her entire identity. Without authority, without the illusion of power, she was just another neighbor, and that was unbearable. That was when my son stepped forward. He hadn't moved much until that moment, letting Karen dominate the stage with her theatrics. But now, he took a deliberate step into the center, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Officer," he said evenly, "if I may." The lead officer nodded, recognizing the badge he'd already been shown. My son didn't raise his voice, didn't posture. He simply spoke with the calm authority of someone who had spent years commanding rooms far more dangerous than this cul-de-sac. "Ma'am," he began, turning his gaze on Karen, "what you've done today is file a false report. You claimed my father was stealing, that his belongings were community property. You misrepresented the situation to emergency services. That's not a bylaw violation. That's misuse of police resources." Karen blinked, her smugness faltering for the first time. She opened her mouth to argue, but my son continued, his tone sharpened by precision. "You have no legal standing to control whether he leaves this neighborhood. Property law doesn't work that way. Homeowners associations have limited jurisdiction, and none of it covers restricting someone's right to move. You've wasted police time, endangered resources that could have been responding to real emergencies, and attempted to intimidate a private citizen." The crowd murmured. Neighbors exchanged glances, some smirking, others nodding in agreement. Karen stammered, That's not. He's twisting." But my son wasn't finished. "You need to understand something," he said, his voice low, steady, and impossibly firm. "I work with federal law enforcement. I deal with people who break actual laws every day. And what you've done here isn't just absurd, it borders on harassment. If you continue down this road, you may find yourself facing consequences you're not prepared for." Silence followed, the kind of silence that falls when a storm finally cracks open the sky. Karen's mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no words came. Her face flushed crimson, her bravado leaking away as quickly as it had come. For once, she wasn't the loudest voice in the room. She wasn't the enforcer, the queen, or the authority. She was simply a woman who had overplayed her hand. The lead officer cleared his throat, stepping in to punctuate the moment. "Ma'am, I suggest you return to your home. There's nothing criminal here. If you continue to interfere, we may have to consider charges for filing a false report." That was it. The end of the performance. Karen stood frozen, eyes darting between the officers, my son, and the watching neighbors. Her empire of bylaws and intimidation had collapsed in real time. With no more weapons left, she did the only thing she could. She turned on her heel and stormed back across the lawn, muttering about appeals and procedures no one cared about. The officers lingered just long enough to ensure the scene had calmed. They offered me a nod of understanding, then returned to their cruisers. The flashing lights faded down the street, leaving only the soft hum of cicadas and the stunned quiet of neighbors processing what they'd witnessed. And in the center of it all, my son stood steady, the calm after the storm. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't boasted. He had simply revealed the truth. Karen's authority was a facade, fragile and hollow when tested against real law. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't thought possible in that neighborhood: freedom. The street was still buzzing long after the cruisers disappeared. Neighbors who had never spoken more than a polite hello suddenly found reasons to linger outside, raking lawns that didn't need raking and watering flowers that didn't need water. They wanted to be part of the story, to say later that they'd been there, that they'd seen Karen's empire collapse. I didn't blame them. For years, she had lorded over every mailbox, every blade of grass, and every trash can placed an inch too far from the curb. She built her identity out of surveillance and intimidation, turning a neighborhood into a fiefdom. And in the span of an afternoon, it all came crashing down under the weight of her own arrogance. As I carried the last box to the truck, I noticed the quiet smirks on my neighbors' faces. They didn't cheer or clap, but their eyes told the story. They were relieved, vindicated. Karen had finally been put in her place, and it hadn't required a rebellion, just a dose of reality she couldn't bend to her will. My son stayed silent, never boasting about what he'd done. He didn't need to. His words had carried more weight than all of Karen's bylaws combined. He had reminded everyone, me most of all, that power isn't found in clipboards or committees. Real authority comes from truth, law, and the ability to stand calmly in the face of chaos. When the truck was finally loaded, I stood on the porch one last time. The house looked smaller somehow, stripped of the dream it once held. I thought of the years I'd spent fighting over inches of grass, the letters typed in stiff HOA language, and the fines that chipped away at joy. And I thought of Karen. I wondered if she would wake the next morning, still convinced she had been right, still clutching her folder of bylaws like a shield, or if, in the quiet of her kitchen, she would feel the sting of humiliation. Would she finally realize that her obsession with control had made her the villain in her own neighborhood? Or would she double down, finding new ways to torment the next poor soul who dared to live outside her invisible lines? I didn't know. What I did know was that I was done. Done with HOA drama. Done with power-hungry neighbors. Done with being policed in the place I called home. As I stepped off the porch for the last time, I felt lighter, like a man finally cutting the last chain from his ankle. My son clapped a hand on my shoulder, his quiet presence saying everything words didn't need to. Together, we climbed into the truck and drove away, the cul-de-sac shrinking in the rearview mirror. The houses grew smaller, the lawns blurred into one another, and then it was gone. I didn't look back. What stayed with me wasn't the house, or even the years I'd spent there. It was the lesson carved into that absurd, unforgettable afternoon. Some people build their sense of power on rules that don't matter. They mistake control for respect and fear for authority. But the moment their rules collide with reality, they crumble. Karen thought she could dictate my freedom. She thought bylaws were stronger than law, that intimidation was stronger than truth. But she learned what many like her eventually do. Power built on paper isn't power at all. And as for me, I learned something too, that freedom isn't just about leaving a place. It's about refusing to let someone else define the boundaries of your life. So I'll leave you with this. If an HOA, or a neighbor, or anyone, can convince themselves they own a piece of your freedom, how much of it have you already given away?